the 1950s. Just saying it makes you think of things like jukeboxes playing happy songs or shiny cars with big fins. People often call it a simpler time, a time when life felt a bit like a sunny afternoon. After the big war, World War II, everyone wanted things to be calm. They wanted happy families and nice houses. This decade seems to glow when we look back at it. It was a time filled with hope for many people. It felt like a fresh start for the world. But was it really all sock hops and milkshakes? That's a good question. Sometimes when we remember the past, we only see the good bits. We're like curators in a museum of our own memories, picking out the shiniest exhibits. The tricky parts, the not-so-great things, can get dusty and forgotten in the storeroom. The 1950s had its own share of problems. Believe me, it wasn't all perfect smiles and neatly mown lawns. It's good to remember that too. It makes the picture more real. Imagine a time before everyone had a computer in their pocket, a time when the internet was just a wild dream. For many folks, television was brand new, a magical box in the living room. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on. You knew your neighbors. The milkman might even leave bottles right on your porch. It was a very different world compared to how we live today. A world that certainly shaped the people who grew up in it, so let's put on our thinking caps, or maybe a fedora, to get in the mood. We're going on a little trip back to this interesting time, the 1950s. We'll look at how families lived. We'll see what kinds of jobs people had. We'll find out what they did for fun, which is always important. And we'll touch on some of the big events that made the news. It's like flipping through an old treasured photo album from your grandma's attic. Each page holds a story. Family was a very big deal in the 1950s. It was the cornerstone of society, as they say. After the war, soldiers came home. They got married and started having children, lots and lots of children. People called it the baby boom. This boom meant new houses were needed, so suburbs sprang up like mushrooms after a spring rain, rows of neat little houses, often with green lawns and those famous white picket fences. It was the dream for many. Inside these homes, life usually followed a pattern. The dad was typically the one who went out to work each day. He was the main breadwinner, bringing home the bacon, so to speak. The mom often stayed home. Her job was taking care of the house and the kids. This was the common picture. You saw it in magazines and on the new television shows. Programs like Father Knows Best showed this kind of family. It was presented as the ideal way to live. Kids had their roles too. They weren't just sitting around eating bonbons. Oh no, they had chores. Maybe they had to take out the trash or help with the dishes, or perhaps cut the grass if they were old enough to handle the mower. After school, the neighborhood was the place to be. Kids would ride their bicycles, play tag, or build secret forts. Dinner was usually a family affair, eaten together around the table. It was a time to share news and connect. Of course, not every single family fit this exact mold. That would be too simple. Some mothers did work outside the home. Some families lived in bustling city apartments, not quiet suburbs. And life wasn't always as perfect as it looked on TV. But the idea of the happy suburban family was very powerful. It was something many people aimed for. A safe home, a loving family, and a sense of security. This was the picture of success for a lot of folks back then. The American economy was really humming in the 1950s. It was like a well-oiled machine. After the war, factories stopped making tanks and planes. They started making cars, refrigerators, and washing machines instead. This meant there were plenty of jobs. Lots of men found good, steady work in these factories. Other people worked in offices, wearing smart suits and ties. Some brave folks even started their own small businesses. It felt like a time of opportunity. The American dream was a phrase you heard a lot. It was this big, hopeful idea. It meant that if you worked hard, you could have a good life. You could own your own home. You could buy a shiny new car. You could provide for your family and give your kids a good start. Many people truly believed in this dream. They put in long hours at their jobs. They saved their money. There was a real sense of optimism in the air for many working people. What kinds of jobs did people have? Well, for men, factory work was common. As I said, construction jobs were also plentiful, building all those new houses. Many men worked as salesmen or mechanics or bus drivers. Policemen and firemen kept communities safe. For women who worked outside the home, the options were often more limited. They might be teachers or nurses or secretaries. Often, women were paid less than men for doing similar work, which wasn't fair at all. Now, while many people were doing well, it wasn't a perfect paradise for everyone. There were still families struggling with poverty, and it was a very tough time for people of color. They faced a lot of discrimination. It was harder for them to get good jobs. They often couldn't live in the same neighborhoods as white people, so that shiny American dream, it wasn't equally open to everybody. This was a big problem, a shadow over the sunny picture of the 1950s. Section 4, Flickering Screens and Radio Waves, 1950s Entertainment. So what did folks do for fun in the 1950s? Without the internet or hundreds of TV channels, life was different. Radio was still a big star in many homes. Families would gather around the radio set in the evening. They'd listen to music programs, news reports, and exciting radio plays. There were comedy shows that made everyone laugh. There were mystery shows that kept you on the edge of your seat. It was a shared family experience, all using their imaginations. Then came television. At the beginning of the 1950s, a TV set was a rare thing, a luxury. But by the end of the decade, most families had one. It was like magic. Black and white pictures flickered in the living room. Comedy shows like I Love Lucy became incredibly popular. Everyone talked about Lucy's latest funny adventure. Westerns like Gunsmoke and Bonanza were big hits too, and variety shows like The Ed Sullivan Show brought singers, dancers and comedians right into your home. Going to the movies was a special treat. The cinemas, or movie palaces as they were sometimes called, were grand places. Hollywood made glamorous movies with big stars. Think of Marilyn Monroe or Rock Hudson. Drive-in theaters were also super popular. You could park your car, hang a speaker on the window, and watch a movie on a giant outdoor screen. Kids often went in their pajamas. It was a fun and cheap night out for the whole family. Popcorn always tasted better at the drive-in, but it wasn't all about screens and radios. People read books and magazines. Lots of them. Families played board games like Monopoly or card games like Canasta. Many towns had roller skating rinks where teenagers glided around. Bowling alleys were popular spots too. And for teenagers, there were dances often called sock hops because you danced in your socks. They jitterbug and twist to the exciting new sounds of rock and roll music. Life was certainly not boring. Section 5. A World in Motion. Big events of the decade. The 1950s weren't just about poodle skirts and happy days. Some really big things were happening in the world, things that made people worry. The Cold War was one of them. This was a long, tense period between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were two very powerful countries with different ideas. People were afraid of a nuclear war. It was a scary thought. Schools even had drills where kids practiced hiding under their desks. Imagine that. There was also a real war. The Korean War. It lasted from 1950 to 1953. American soldiers were sent to fight far away in Korea. This war brought sadness and anxiety to many families back home. People listened to the news carefully. They prayed for their loved ones. It was a serious conflict that reminded everyone that peace was not guaranteed. It cast a shadow over the early part of the decade. Many young men lost their lives. A very important movement started to gain strength in the 1950s. This was the civil rights movement. For a long time, African Americans had been treated unfairly. They faced segregation, meaning they were kept separate in schools, buses and restaurants. Brave people like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began to lead the fight for equality. In 1954, a big court case called Brownborough Board of Education said that separate schools for black and white children were not legal. This was a huge step. Science and technology were also making big news. In 1957, the Soviet Union surprised the world. They launched a satellite called Sputnik into space. It was the first man-made object to orbit the Earth. This shocked many Americans. It started something called the space race. The US wanted to catch up and go even further. This event also made people realize the importance of science and math education. The world was changing very quickly, and these events were pushing it forward. Section 6. Poodle skirts and rock and roll culture and trends. Fashion in the 1950s had a very particular style. You can often spot a 50s movie just by the clothes. For women, full skirts were all the rage. Sometimes they wore fluffy petticoats underneath to make the skirts stand out even more. Tight-fitting sweaters, often worn as a set with a matching cardigan, were also popular. When women went out, they often wore gloves and a hat. It was considered very elegant and proper. Looking neat and tidy was important. Men's fashion was a bit more on the serious side, especially for work. Men usually wore suits. The jackets often had narrow lapels. For casual times, they might wear slacks and a comfortable sports shirt, but the teenagers, they were different. They started to create their own style. Boys wore blue jeans, which was still quite rugged. They wore plain white t-shirts and sometimes cool leather jackets, trying to look like movie stars such as Marlon Brando or James Dean. Teenagers had all sorts of fads. Poodle skirts were a must-have for many girls. These were wide swinging skirts, often made of felt. They usually had a picture of a poodle sewn onto them. Boys sometimes slicked their hair back with Brill cream or other hair grease. This created a shiny, sculpted look, sometimes called a ducktail at the back. Wearing your boyfriend's Letterman sweater, showing off his school sports achievements, was a big deal for girls. These fads were all part of being young. Music was changing in a massive way too. At the start of the decade, popular music was often gentle. Think of singers like Perry Como or Paddy Page. But then rock and roll exploded onto the scene. Artists like Bill Haley, Chuck Berry and Little Richard brought a new wild energy. It had a strong beat and made you want to dance. Elvis Presley became the undisputed king of rock and roll. His music and his moves shocked some older folks, but the kids absolutely loved it. It was the sound of a new generation. Section 7. Conclusion: reflections on a bygone era, so the 1950s. It was quite a decade, wasn't it? A time of shiny chrome cars and new suburban houses. A time of hope for many people after the dark years of war. But it was also a time with its own shadows. There was the fear of the Cold War and nuclear bombs. There was the struggle for basic rights for many citizens. It's easy to look back and see only the happy, simple parts. But like any time in history, it was complicated, full of good things and not so good things all mixed together. When people think about the 1950s today, they often feel a sense of nostalgia. That's a warm, fuzzy feeling for the past. They remember the strong communities where neighbors knew each other. They recall the fun of drive-in movies and sock hops in the school gym. These memories are precious, but it's also important to remember the other side. The parts that weren't so rosy, the challenges people faced. This gives us a more complete and honest picture of what life was really like. Looking back, it's clear that the 1950s set the stage for many things we see today. The television became a central part of family life. The suburbs grew and changed how people lived. The music of the 1950s, especially rock and roll, still influences musicians now. The fight for civil rights that gained so much power in that decade continues to be important. It was a time of big changes, a real turning point. It shaped the world we live in now in so many ways. So the 1950s was more than just a backdrop for old movies. It was a living, breathing time, full of real people with hopes and dreams, just like us. Thinking about it feels a bit like finding an old treasure map. It shows you where things were and maybe gives you clues about where things are going. It was a fascinating chapter in the big book of history, and it reminds us that every decade has its own special story to tell. Pretty interesting stuff when you think about it.